They ate their horses. Then they ate their dogs. Then they ate rats. And when there were no rats left, they started eating leather, boiled belts, shoe soles, anything to survive. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part. They were the winners. This is the story of the Siege of Antioch, where 40,000 Crusaders nearly starved to death while trying to conquer one of the most powerful cities in the Middle East. And what happened inside those walls was so horrific, so desperate that even medieval chroniclers were too disturbed to write down all the details. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this siege broke men's minds and bodies in ways that war alone never could. Let me take you back to 1097, to understand why Antioch mattered so much, and why men were willing to endure absolute hell to capture it. You need to understand what the First Crusade was really about. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a massive crowd in Clermont, France, and delivered one of history's most consequential speeches. He told them that Muslims had taken the Holy Land, that Christian pilgrims were being persecuted, that Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christianity, needed to be liberated. And he promised something incredible. Anyone who died on this holy mission would have all their sins forgiven. Instant salvation. A guaranteed ticket to heaven. Thousands of men took up the cross that day. Knights seeking glory, peasants seeking redemption, criminals seeking forgiveness, younger sons with no inheritance seeking fortune. They all believed God wanted them to march to Jerusalem and take it back. What they didn't know was that most of them would never see Jerusalem. Most would die long before reaching the Holy Land, and the ones who survived, they'd be forever changed by what they experienced. The Crusader army that marched east in 1096 was massive. Estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 people, though only about 40,000 were actual fighting men. The rest were pilgrims, priests, women, children, and camp followers. This wasn't just an army. It was a migration. A moving city of people convinced they were doing God's work. They marched across Europe, then through Byzantine territory, suffering losses along the way. By the time they reached Anatolia in 1097, they'd already been reduced by disease, starvation, and skirmishes with Turkish forces. But they pressed on, driven by faith and the promise of riches waiting in the wealthy cities of the East. And then, in October 1097, they saw it, Antioch, and they realized they'd made a terrible mistake. Antioch wasn't just any city. It was one of the great metropolises of the ancient world. Massive stone walls, 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, stretched for miles around the city. Over 400 towers reinforced those walls. The city sat against the slopes of Mount Silpius, making it nearly impossible to surround completely. And inside those walls were 100,000 people and a garrison of elite Turkish warriors led by Yogi Sian, a cunning and experienced commander. The Crusaders looked at those walls and realized something terrifying. They couldn't assault this city. Their siege equipment was inadequate. Their numbers, while large, weren't enough to completely surround Antioch. And winter was coming, but they'd come too far to turn back. Jerusalem was still 500 miles away. If they bypassed Antioch, the Turkish garrison could attack them from behind, cutting their supply lines and destroying them. They had no choice. They had to take Antioch. Somehow. So in October 1097, the Crusader army settled in for a siege. And what followed was 8 months of the most horrific suffering imaginable. Here's what the Crusaders didn't understand about sieges in this region. European sieges usually lasted weeks, maybe a couple months at most. But Middle Eastern cities were designed to withstand years-long sieges. They had massive food stores, wells inside the walls, and populations experienced in siege survival. The defenders of Antioch could wait. The Crusaders, they couldn't. The first problem became apparent within weeks. Food. The Crusader army needed thousands of tons of food to survive. But they were in hostile territory, surrounded by cities and villages loyal to the Turks. Local suppliers weren't going to sell them food. They'd have to forage for it, hunt for it, fight for it. Foraging parties would ride out every day, traveling farther and farther from camp, to find food. At first, they found villages with grain and livestock. They'd take what they needed, often by force. But as the siege dragged on, they'd strip the surrounding countryside bare. The villages were empty. The fields were harvested. There was nothing left. And winter arrived. November, December, January. The cold in this region isn't like European cold. It's a wet, bone-chilling cold that seeps into everything. The Crusaders, many of them from warmer climates, hadn't prepared for this. They had inadequate shelter, thin clothing, and no firewood because they'd burned everything nearby for warmth. Men started dying. Not from battle, from cold, from disease, from starvation. The camp chroniclers wrote about soldiers found frozen to death in their tents, about knights too weak from hunger to wear their armor, about horses dying by the hundreds because there was no fodder to feed them. And this is where the real horror begins. Because when food runs out, humans become capable of almost anything. By December 1097, just 2 months into the siege, the food situation had become desperate. The horses were dying anyway, so the Crusaders started eating them. Horse meat became a luxury. Knights who'd spent fortunes on their war horses now watched them being butchered for food. Some wept as they ate their own beloved mounts. But hunger overrides sentiment. When the horses were gone, they ate the donkeys, then the mules, then the dogs that had followed the army. Anything with meat on it was killed and consumed. Camp followers would fight over scraps. Men would kill each other over a piece of rotten meat. Then they ran out of animals, so they started eating things that weren't food. Leather was boiled for hours until it became soft enough to chew. Belts, shoe soles, saddles, anything made of leather was thrown into pots and cooked into a disgusting stew. Chroniclers describe men's mouths being shredded by the tough, indigestible leather. But they ate it anyway because the alternative was starvation. They ate grass. They ate tree bark. They ate roots dug from the frozen ground. Some men ate things the chroniclers refused to write down, things too disturbing to record. Use your imagination. The psychological impact was devastating. These were Christian warriors on a holy mission. They'd been promised glory and salvation. Instead, they were reduced to eating garbage and dying in the mud. Many lost their faith entirely. How could a loving God let this happen to men fighting in his name? Desertion became rampant. Every night men would slip away from camp, trying to reach the coast and find ships home. Some made it. Most were caught by Turkish patrols and killed or sold into slavery. One of the most famous deserters was Peter the Hermit, one of the original preachers who'd helped inspire the Crusade. Even he tried to flee. He was caught and brought back in disgrace. But here's the twisted irony. While the Crusaders starved outside the walls, the people inside Antioch were doing fine. They had years of food stockpiled. They had fresh water from wells. They'd occasionally open the gates and send out cavalry to attack the weakened Crusaders, killing dozens before retreating back to safety. It was psychological warfare. They wanted the Crusaders to see how strong and well-fed they were. Yagi Siyan, the Turkish commander, was a brilliant strategist. He knew he didn't need to defeat the Crusaders in battle. He just needed to wait. Winter, disease, and starvation were doing his work for him. Every week that passed, the Crusader army grew weaker. Eventually, they'd be so depleted that his garrison could sally out and destroy them completely. And he was right. By March 1098, 5 months into the siege, the Crusader army had been reduced from 40,000 fighting men to maybe 20,000 combat-effective soldiers. Thousands had died. Thousands more had deserted. Those who remained were walking skeletons, barely able to lift their weapons. The Crusader leaders knew they were losing. Bohemond of Taranto, one of the most powerful nobles, called a council. They had 3 options: retreat and abandon the crusade, continue the siege and probably die, or find some way to take the city by force or treachery. Retreat was unthinkable. They'd come too far, suffered too much. To turn back now would mean all that suffering was for nothing. Continuing the siege meant slow death, so treachery it was. But how do you betray an impregnable fortress? This is where the story takes an incredible turn. Because sometimes desperation breeds luck. One of Bohemond's agents made contact with a man inside Antioch named Firuz. He was an Armenian Christian who'd converted to Islam and now served as a guard captain on one of the city's towers. But Firuz had a problem. Yagisian suspected him of disloyalty and had been threatening him. Firuz was terrified he'd be executed. Bohemond saw an opportunity. Through secret messages, he convinced Firuz to betray the city. The deal? Firuz would let Crusader soldiers into his tower at night. In exchange, Bohemond would give him money, protection, and reinstate him as a Christian. Firuz agreed. Desperation makes traitors of us all. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, the plan was executed. Under cover of darkness, a small group of Crusaders approached Firuz's tower. He lowered rope ladders. About 60 knights climbed up, killed the few guards who weren't in on the plot, and opened the tower gates from inside. Hundreds more Crusaders poured in. They rushed through the streets toward the main gates. The city guards, caught completely by surprise, tried to organize a defense, but it was too late. The Crusaders opened the main gates, and the entire army flooded into Antioch. What happened next was a massacre. 8 months of starvation, suffering, and rage exploded in an orgy of violence. The Crusaders killed everyone they could find. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. Turkish soldiers were cut down. Civilians were slaughtered in their homes. The streets ran with blood. Yagisian tried to escape, but was caught and killed. His head was brought to Bohemond as a trophy. The Crusaders looted everything of value. Food, gold, weapons, anything they could carry. After 8 months of starvation, they gorged themselves on the city's supplies. Many made themselves sick from eating too much too quickly after months of near starvation. Here's the cruel twist of fate. Just when the Crusaders thought their suffering was over, it got worse. Much worse. 3 days after capturing Antioch, scouts brought terrifying news. A massive Muslim relief army was approaching. Led by Kerboga, the Atobago Mosul, this force numbered around 75,000 soldiers. They'd been marching to relieve Antioch, and now they were just days away. The Crusaders had gone from besiegers to besieged. They were now trapped inside the city they'd just captured, surrounded by an enormous enemy army. And here's the nightmare. They'd eaten most of Antioch's food supplies in their initial gorging. They'd destroyed a lot more during the fighting. A city that had withstood an 8-month siege from the outside couldn't withstand a siege from the inside. On June 5th, Kerboga's army arrived and surrounded Antioch. The Crusaders, who'd barely survived 8 months of starvation while besieging the city, were now going to experience it from the other side. And this time, there was no guarantee of treachery to save them. The situation inside Antioch became even more desperate than before. At least during the first siege, the Crusaders could forage in the countryside. Now they were trapped inside stone walls with no way out. The food they'd found in the city, gone within days. They were back to starvation rations, but this time with no relief in sight. Men started dying again, but now they were dying in the thousands, not dozens. Disease spread rapidly in the crowded, unsanitary conditions. The corpses of Turkish defenders killed during the capture were still rotting in the streets, breeding plague. The Crusaders were too weak to bury them all. Morale collapsed completely. After everything they'd endured, after finally taking the city, they were right back where they started, trapped, starving, and dying. Many soldiers openly talked about surrender. Better to be slaves than to die of starvation in this cursed city. The Crusader leaders were in despair. They'd send messages to the Byzantine emperor begging for help, but no help was coming. They were alone, surrounded, and running out of time. Then something bizarre happened. Something so strange that historians still debate whether it really occurred or if it was mass delusion brought on by starvation. A poor peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward claiming he'd had visions. He said St. Andrew had appeared to him and told him where to find the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Jesus Christ's side during the crucifixion. And this lance, Peter claimed, was buried beneath the floor of Antioch's cathedral. Most of the leaders were skeptical. This sounded like the delirious ramblings of a starving man. But one leader, Raymond of Toulouse, believed him. Or at least he understood the psychological value of belief. The army needed hope, needed a miracle. And if a holy relic could provide that hope, even if it was fake, it might be worth it. So, they dug. In the cathedral floor, in the exact spot Peter had indicated, they dug for hours. And incredibly, they found a spearhead. Ancient, rusted, but unmistakably a spearhead. Peter Bartholomew proclaimed it was the Holy Lance, a miracle from God. Was it real? Probably not. Most historians think Peter or someone else planted it there. But here's what matters. The soldiers believed. After months of suffering, they had tangible proof that God was with them. Their faith, which had been shattered by starvation and death, was restored. The transformation was immediate and remarkable. Men who'd been too weak to stand suddenly found strength. Knights who'd been ready to surrender began sharpening their weapons. The entire army, numbering maybe 15,000 combat-capable soldiers at this point, prepared to do something insane. They were going to attack Kerboga's 75,000-man army. In the open field, a starving, weakened force of 15,000 against a fresh, well-supplied army 5 times their size. It was suicide. But they were going to do it anyway because they believed God wanted them to. On June 28, 1098, the gates of Antioch opened, and the Crusaders marched out to face their destiny. Kerboga couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Crusaders were supposed to be broken, starving, defeated. Yet here they were, marching out in battle formation, banners flying, priests carrying the Holy Lance at the front of their lines. It was either incredible courage or complete madness. Probably both. The Crusaders formed up in several divisions. They were so weak that many couldn't wear full armor. Some fought in just tunics and leather. They hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. By all logic, they should have collapsed after the first charge. Kerboga ordered his cavalry to attack. Thousands of Turkish horsemen, the finest light cavalry in the world, charged the Crusader lines. This should have been a massacre, and it nearly was. The initial impact was devastating. Turkish arrows darkened the sky. Crusader soldiers fell by the dozens. The lines wavered. Men started to break. This was it, the end. But then something unexpected happened. The Crusader cavalry, led by Bohemond, charged. These men, half-starved and barely able to sit on their malnourished horses, charged directly into the Turkish cavalry. And somehow, impossibly, they broke through. The Turkish cavalry, who'd expected an easy victory against a weakened enemy, suddenly found themselves in a vicious close-quarters melee, with men who fought with the desperation of those with nothing to lose. The Crusaders were literally fighting for their lives. Surrender meant slavery or death. So they fought with a ferocity that shocked their enemies. Kerboga's lines began to falter. His commanders sent conflicting orders. Units became separated, and the Crusaders, sensing weakness, pressed their attack harder. The battle lasted hours. The Crusaders, who should have been exhausted within minutes, somehow kept fighting. Adrenaline, faith, desperation, whatever it was, it kept them going when their bodies should have failed. And then Kerboga's army began to retreat. Slowly at first, then faster. The retreat became a rout. 75,000 Muslim soldiers were fleeing from 15,000 starving Crusaders. It was impossible. It defied all military logic. But it was happening. The Crusaders pursued them for miles, killing stragglers and capturing supplies. When they finally returned to Antioch, they found Kerboga's camp abandoned. Tents full of food, weapons, gold, everything the massive army had left behind in their panicked flight. The Siege of Antioch was over. Against impossible odds, after 8 months of the worst suffering imaginable, after being besieged and counter-besieged, after starvation had reduced them to eating leather and rats, the Crusaders had won. Not just survived, won. The aftermath was as complex as the battle itself. Let me tell you what happened to these men after their impossible victory. The Crusaders had captured Antioch, but at what cost? Of the 40,000 fighting men who'd started the siege in October 1097, maybe 12,000 remained alive and able to fight. The rest were dead from starvation, disease, or battle. The non-combatants had suffered even worse. Tens of thousands of pilgrims, followers, and civilians had perished. The army that had arrived at Antioch had been reduced by 70%, and they still had 500 miles to go before reaching Jerusalem. The crusade that was supposed to be a glorious march to the Holy Land had become a death march, where survival itself was a victory. But they'd learned something crucial during those 8 months. They'd learned they could endure absolutely anything. Starvation? They'd survived it. Disease? They'd survived it. Betrayal and despair? They'd survived that too. They'd been broken down to their most basic components and rebuilt into something harder, more dangerous. The men who marched out of Antioch toward Jerusalem in January 1099 were not the same men who'd arrived there in 1097. They were thinner, harder, with eyes that had seen too much suffering. They'd eaten things humans shouldn't eat. They'd done things they'd never speak of again. The Siege of Antioch had transformed them from a Crusader army into something more like a horde of vengeful ghosts. And when they finally reached Jerusalem in June 1099 and captured it after a much shorter siege, the violence they unleashed was partly revenge for everything they'd endured at Antioch. The suffering they'd experienced had to be paid for in blood. Now let's talk about why this siege matters beyond the immediate events. Because Antioch changed the entire nature of the Crusades in medieval warfare. First, it proved that faith alone wasn't enough. The Crusaders had started with absolute confidence that God would deliver them victory. But God hadn't stopped them from starving. God hadn't prevented disease from decimating their ranks. Faith might have kept them going, but treachery, luck, and desperate violence actually won the battle. Second, it showed the limits of siege warfare in this era. Neither side could maintain an effective siege indefinitely. The Crusaders couldn't take Antioch by force, and the Muslims couldn't dislodge them. The stalemate was only broken by betrayal. This pattern would repeat throughout the Crusader period. Third, the Holy Lance incident revealed how psychological warfare and morale mattered as much as tactics. Whether the lance was real or fake didn't matter. What mattered was that the soldiers believed in it. That belief turned defeated men into warriors willing to attempt the impossible. And finally, Antioch demonstrated the absolute brutality of medieval warfare in ways that shocked even that brutal age. The starvation, the cannibalism that chroniclers hinted at but wouldn't describe. The massacres after the city fell. All of it showed that when pushed to extremes, humans are capable of extraordinary cruelty. So what can we learn from the Siege of Antioch? What's the lesson here? Maybe it's that victory often comes at a cost so high that it barely resembles victory at all. The Crusaders took Antioch, but they paid for it with their humanity. Survived, but they were forever changed by what they'd endured and what they'd done to survive. Or maybe the lesson is about the danger of certainty. The Crusaders were absolutely certain God was on their side. That certainty led them into situations where thousands died unnecessarily. Faith is powerful, but when it becomes blind certainty, it can lead to catastrophe. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler. Perhaps it's just that humans are capable of enduring unimaginable suffering when they believe they have no other choice. The Crusaders at Antioch couldn't retreat. They couldn't surrender. So they endured. And somehow, against all logic and odds, they survived. The Siege of Antioch doesn't get talked about much today. When people discuss the Crusades, they focus on Jerusalem. But Antioch was where the First Crusade nearly ended. It was where thousands of men discovered their breaking point, then somehow found a way to keep going anyway. Today, you can still visit Antioch, now called Antakya in Turkey. Parts of those massive walls still stand. The towers that Firuz betrayed are still there. And if you walk those ancient streets, you can almost hear the echoes of that terrible siege. The screams of the starving, the prayers of the desperate, the clash of steel when broken men found the strength to fight one more time. This was the crusade that nearly starved to death. This was the siege where eating leather was considered lucky. This was the moment when faith and desperation collided with such force that even today, over 900 years later, It's hard to comprehend how anyone survived it at all, but they did survive. And that survival, more than any glorious battle or heroic charge, defined what the Crusades would become. A brutal, grinding struggle where victory and defeat were sometimes indistinguishable, where faith and violence were inseparable, and where the cost of winning was almost as terrible as the cost of losing. That's the real story of Antioch. Not a glorious victory, but a desperate survival. And sometimes, survival is the most impressive victory of all.